Here are the most dangerous tribes the world is hiding from us. Who do you think is more dangerous, these tribes or the people who try to control them? Let us know your thoughts below. Number 10. West Papua. The island of Papua has a complex colonial history, with the western half being colonized by the Dutch, the northeastern half being colonized by the Germans, and the southeastern half colonized by the British. After World War I, the east half became an Australian territory, though still under technical British rule, while the western half would be conquered by Indonesia during their wars against the Dutch. For the native Papuans, however, this meant fundamentally nothing changed. There are 1,000 unique languages on the island of Papua and a rich local culture and history, but despite the indigenous people being outnumbered by settlers, very few of the indigenous peoples have any ties to Indonesia, culturally or ethnically, and essentially continue to be exploited by a colonial power. Papua is a dense jungle island, the site of some of the most harrowing fighting in all of World War II, and for many of the indigenous groups in Western Papua, the jungle is beginning to see bloodshed again. The Papua Merdeka movement, or Free Papua movement, has been fighting for independence for the indigenous people of Papua since the 1960s, yet receive little international attention as the Indonesian army continues to bomb them. This led to their kidnapping of a New Zealand pilot who, to be honest, looks incredibly chill in photos. While some Merdeka fighters use modern weapons, many still use the massive hunting bows with spear-like arrows that their ancestors used for generations. Number 9. The Sentinelese. Perhaps the most famous uncontacted tribe, thanks to a fish-brained missionary, the Sentinelese are an Andamanese people and highly resistant to contact. In the contact that has been made, it has been discovered that their language, while having distant roots in the same languages as nearby indigenous groups, is so massively different they must have stopped contact with the outside world thousands of years ago. The Sentinelese have a history going back at least 100 years of killing or trying to kill every single person who stayed on their shores. From as early as 1867, the Sentinelese have attacked outsiders with bows and arrows, spears, and throwing clubs. A convict who escaped in 1896 was discovered on the shore filled with arrow holes and a cut throat. However, in the mid-1900s, in order to prevent nearby mercenary groups from exploiting and wiping out the Sentinelese, the Indian government claimed control of the island and set up an exclusion zone for 3 miles around it. Since then, any group intending to meet the Sentinelese is met by a volley of arrow fire first. Some of the first times contact had been made, the Sentinelese simply retreated into the jungle. However, the British explorers kept searching until they kidnapped people too old or young to be able to escape, brought them back to the mainland to parade around, only for them to die of disease, because, obviously. Perhaps it's understandable that the Sentinelese have learned since to react with such violence. Number 8. The Awa. The Awa people are an indigenous group of Brazil living in the Amazon. With the advent of colonialism and increased contact with Europeans, the Awa adopted a nomadic lifestyle to escape the constant attacks and violence. However, they have continued to be the most threatened indigenous group in the world. The primary threat? Loggers. It took decades of petitioning the Brazilian government before they finally demarcated the protected territories for the Awa, but with FUNAI, the government org assigned with their protection, only getting 15% of its required yearly funding, there simply isn't a way to enforce the protected zone. This has led to horrific violence committed against the Awa people, and all too few retaliatory strikes against the loggers. In 2011, an Awa girl, 10 years from being an adult, was kidnapped and immolated alive by loggers, likely after being severely maltreated. This was a sign to the indigenous people of the Amazon that the loggers were coming to wipe them out and destroy their homes. There are only 60 of the Awa who still live their traditional ways in the wild, and fewer than 400 left in Brazil. Disease and violence from illegal loggers and poachers are the greatest threats that they face. Number 7. Nukak. The Nukak people are semi-migratory indigenous people in Colombia. They are highly talented hunters and fishers and practice shifting horticulture, where they plant edible plants along their yearly routes through the jungle, all essentially timed to fruit and flower around when the Nukak pass through. They have a fascinating and rich culture, but that is all under severe threat. Since they were first contacted in 1981 by the New Tribes Mission, evangelicals bent on preaching to uncontacted tribes, over half of their population has died to measles, malaria, and pulmonary disease. As well, their ancestral lands have been occupied by far-left militias and far-right paramilitaries, along with the Colombian army and drug traffickers, all of whom are constantly waging war against each other. In 2006, the Spanish Nucac leader Ma Bay, having failed to secure his people's land and a way to return to their ancestral territories, took his life with poison. Since then, many have been forced to assimilate or live with the near constant threat of some armed group or another destroying their villages. Number 6. Kawahiva. The Kawahiva were first discovered in 1999, and since then have faced illegal logging, kidnapping, slavery, and literal genocide. They have kept on the move for their entire known history from our perspective, seemingly in an attempt to avoid contact and further violence. However, Survival International has said they are likely being hunted down, broken up, and forced into the jungle by loggers, intent on preventing organized resistance to their illegal logging. In 2005, the protection of the Kawahiva's land was revoked, and although it was reinstated soon after, it was enough time to allow for several bands of heavily armed loggers to roam through the woods, massacring any groups of Kawahiva they found. No arrests would ever be made, and the Kawahiva are still heavily threatened. This constant hunting of their people has led the Kawahiva to engage in sporadic and occasional acts of violence and defense against the illegal loggers, but bows and arrows are no match for M16s and rockets. And as long as this is left to be decided by the violence of the loggers in Kawahiva, the Kawahiva will continue to be enslaved and killed until either they are gone or their land is. Number 5. Taramanane. The Taramanane and the Tagari are the last uncontacted tribes in Ecuador, and are believed to both be descendants of the Huarani tribes. They hunt with long blowguns and darts dipped in poison, and there seem to be 150 to 300 of them left in the wilderness. However, they are severely threatened by illegal loggers, with 5 Taramanane and Tagari corpses being found in 2008 who were killed by the loggers. The first time the Huarani were contacted, they, perhaps wisely, immediately attacked and killed the missionaries with spears, having been airdropped photographs and believing them to be demonic. The poison of their darts is actually a deeply spiritually and culturally important aspect. As to the Huarani, killing of any kind is unethical, and the spirits of the dead must be appeased. But this poison, which causes instant paralysis and a supposedly painless death, is prepared by the tribe's shaman so that hunting is more like harvesting from the trees than ending an animal's life. The Taramanane are still deeply under threat from illegal logging and disease. Number 4. Nomole. In 1894, the Nomole people, for that is how they call themselves, not Mashko Piro, which is derogatory, were murdered en masse and expelled from their ancestral lands by Carlos Fitzgerald, a brutal rubber baron. They were thought to have been wiped out. However, sightings increased throughout the 1900s, and by 1976 there were believed to be some 20 to 100 of them in the jungle. In 1998, they were estimated to have around 100 to 250 people. Oil and gas exploration and exploitation, along with illegal logging, have driven them into more frequent contact with the outside world. In 2012, an anthropologist would release several images taken of the Nomole, and days later, his guide would be discovered with a bamboo-tipped arrow in his heart, a Nomole specialty. The Peruvian government has ordered that no contact be made, as any outsider may have any number of diseases that the Nomole are simply not prepared to face. Number 3. Corubo. The Corubo learned in the 1950s, after a string of massacres perpetrated against them, that violence was sometimes the only way to solve a problem. Peaceful contact was to be made in 1976, and from that time to 1996, 7 Funai workers would die. Eventually, the Corubo tribe would split, with some 20 individuals wanting to be less isolationist and have more contact with the other tribes in the outside world. The larger isolationist tribe has not been contacted since, but it is known the smaller tribe is led by a warrior named Tavan, who led his people in a series of raids against the loggers, ending 3 loggers' lives. The goal of Funai is to keep the Corubo protected and as isolated as they wish, to preserve their people and their way of life. Number 2. Ayoreo. The Ayoreo were first contacted in 1720 by missionaries, but the attempts at conversion were abandoned by 1740. However, as the states of Bolivia and Paraguay, whom the Ayoreo straddle the borders of, began to rise in power, they both began to see the Ayoreo as a problem. This was so institutionalized that from 1940 to 1970, a soldier could get out of their army service by delivering an Ayoreo corpse to his commanding officer. Their young ones were kidnapped and put on display in zoos, and the Ayoreo were manipulated and scammed out of their land, eviscerated by disease, and forced to assimilate and give up their culture and way of life, and to forcibly assimilate other Ayoreo. This is definitionally genocide. However, the Totobagasode group have remained uncontacted and hidden in the jungle, using violence to prevent evangelizing Ayoreo and Western workers from making contact and doing to them what was done to all their brothers and sisters. They are the only uncontacted tribe in the Americas outside of the Amazon. The Ayoreo who were forced to assimilate suffer from disproportionate poverty and racism, while those who stayed in the jungle are at heavy threat from loggers, poachers, and disease. Number 1. Yanomami. The Yanomami are a group of some 250 villages and tribes interspersed throughout the southern border of Venezuela and north of Brazil. Violence has long been an aspect of Yanomami life, though it is not an ingrained warlike state like some may have claimed. The Yanomami are engaged in near constant competition for resources with the other groups around them, and do not significantly differentiate between other tribes and other Yanomami. Half of all Yanomami deaths are attributed to violence, but much of it is not from intertribal warfare. Illegal miners and loggers, many brought from the 80s gold rush, have been the cause of many of the deaths, as the Yanomami try and defend their ancestral and government-given land. But fear not, the Venezuelan government has a solution. Just make the mining legal. That way you don't have an issue with illegal mining and instead have an issue with indigenous people fighting for their rights. Something governments the world around have no issue dealing with bullets and blades. Those were the most dangerous tribes the world is hiding from us. If you learned, please like, comment, and share, and be sure to follow for more.